What profession has way more people on illegal substances than people realize? Once I got into dental school, our eyes were opened by the Well-Being Foundation, an arm of the Missouri Dental Association. A couple of guys who were users, had been in recovery for years, came and discussed substance misuse and just how wild it can spiral. After talking to a friend and mentor who has been for 45 years, he talked about how many healthcare professionals from all disciplines there were just in our little rural area, no names or personal info, of course. Crazy to me still that people I would have never suspected, and so many of them were the high-functioning type A go-getters. So that's what the 9 out of 10 dentists are up to, huh? Story 2, not always illegal substances, but K-12 teaching. One of the reasons I quit was because I saw so many teachers developing a home is where the wine is lifestyle after their first few years. At one school, I was given alcohol on my first day as a quote-unquote joke because I was going to need it. In the education community, alcoholism and substance use absolutely exploded during the lockdown when teachers had to work from home with increased levels of stress, decreased support, and constant access to substances. A lot of teachers are also hard partiers outside of work hours because of the stress. Very few teachers are going to show up to teach children while on substances, but some people I knew definitely did that stuff routinely on the weekends as a way to blow off steam. It takes a lot less time than actual self-care. I'm sober, and in the 12-step community, the amount of teachers in my meetings who are recovering from addictions developed during the lockdown, every possible kind of fixation, is insane. I am very happy I switched career paths. Story 3. Farriers, as in horseshoeing. 98% of farriers are extreme heavy drinkers. The job has extremely high stress and high stakes. Most people don't realize that shoeing a horse is extremely dangerous. They see videos online and think that horses are big dogs. They're not. They are 1,200-pound or more animals with the flight instincts of a deer. They can crush you and not even know it. On top of that, you spend long periods of time isolated in a truck, driving between stops, dealing with traffic and terrible drivers. On top of that, you're interacting with owners who know next to nothing about hoof care, but have the ability to fire you and, depending on how many horses they own, put you in financial ruin. Horses get new shoes every 4 to 5 weeks, or your body never gets a break. You're expected to be on call at all times on top of dealing with veterinarians and the people training the horses. Story 4. Anesthesiologists. I had a case where someone stole stuff off an anesthesiologist's cart. The hospital figured, we can just test everyone who had access to the room, and whoever tests positive for it is the one that stole from the cart. Nope, everyone tested positive for it. The anesthesiologist, the tech, the nurse, the pharmacist, and the pharm tech all tested positive. Turns out more than 30% of people who work in anesthesiology fields self-report diverting substances for personal use. Those are just the ones that casually admit it. Story 5. Lawyers, doctors and nurses, chefs, cooks, waiters, waitresses, construction, truckers, and honestly, a lot of people in power right now. Presidential staff, representatives, college professors, a lot of people in a science and chemist work. Wife is a chemist, and 90% of her coworkers and managers have admitted to substance usage. Basically, any type of work that requires a lot of long hours, intense concentration, and the ability to be available at any given time. I'm not against the people who use for these reasons, honestly. It sucks, but they do what they have to do in order to survive and get the job done and not get replaced. I am, however, against the place we're at in the world where these poor people feel like this is the route they have to take in order to do what they are ordered to do so they can afford to survive and be a quote-unquote team player. You cannot expect your average person to work high-stress jobs with high-stress hours and a high-stress work-week schedule while also demonizing these people for doing and using whatever they can to be your ideal tool to use and misuse. And when they can't because they've tried to give up substances or never use them but are burning out, they are tossed away like trash. It's sad. Story 6. I would guess the actual answer is where opposites collide. Math with me. If 70% of rock and roll singers were on illegal substances, it would not surprise you. You would think closer to 90, right? And not be amazed because you expect it. But if 10% of substance and alcohol counselors were fixated to illegal substances, you go, whoa, wait. But since most are former users, the number of ex-users who continue to do illegal substances is actually quite high, likely closer to 50%. Source, me, worked as a chaplain in a treatment center. Most of the staff eventually relapse, which means something like 50%, not at once, but along a period of 5 years, succumb to their fixation and relapse. So the then people realize puts us into professions like substance misuse counselors because they are former users and see people in the worst parts of recovery every day, so should know better, and yet it's not about knowing any better, it's about biology and emotions. Story 7. 20 years ago, I worked in a call center. 10% of the workers seemed on the up and up. 40% would frequently take grass breaks, and the other 50% were dripping sweat with fans on them because they were on substances. Pills were passed around regularly. Several lived in their vans across the street before van life was a thing. One of the up-and-up workers spoke to HR about the substances and were told, quote, "It's part of the company culture." Basically, they didn't care as long as sales were made. Story 8. Child residential support and social workers. I knew 25% were on grass. I was told another appeared to be on acid during a shift and was told informally, in no uncertain terms, to sort his crap out or be reported. We were experts and trained on spotting substance use. Many had extensive personal experience. An external consultant was brought in to discuss how to change substance policy and awareness. He couldn't work directly with the council due to having a conviction for substance use. Having children detail an essay is enough for anyone to want to numb themselves to it, or seeing profoundly disabled children in serious distress. One child was heavily involved in a substance gang. A senior social worker was threatened if he intervened. Said child ended up in a French prison for smuggling for a few years. It broke me after 2 years. Story 9. This feed is why substances need to be regulated and not illegal. There are so many people that would benefit from regulating the substance that are put out than locking away everything from coming close to safe for consumption. What a failure the United States has become on this. What an utter and total complete failure we are as a people to allow ourselves to be fooled that fixation is someone that's real when we all operate on the same dopamine and serotonin. What a freaking joke. Story 10. I see a lot of quote-unquote law enforcement comments. I retired from a medium-sized agency after 29 years of service. We had about 160 sworn officers. We were subject to random screens. In that time, I can think of only one officer that failed the test. He had a prescription in his system and no prescription. He was terminated for it. I'm retired now, so no reason to lie, but in all honesty, I truly never saw it at my agency, not even grass use. I wouldn't have tolerated it if I had. Now, I realize this is anecdotal, but that just wasn't the culture at my agency or any agency I interacted with. I realize other areas of the country may have a different police culture, so I'm not denying it happens. I'm not even denying it may have happened at my agency, but it certainly wasn't something common. I bet their agency's motto was to serve and protect and definitely not get spiked while doing it. Story 11. My mother-in-law's boyfriend works at a wood manufacturing plant. They employ about 100 people, and it seems like many of them struggle with alcohol or substance misuse. This is the third plant he's worked at in 11 years, and he says the environment has been similar at all of them. These plants use giant presses to glue and join wooden beams for industrial construction. They also have a machine that wraps bundles of wood together with wire. I remember him telling me a story about a man who lost an eye. Apparently, he was under the influence and couldn't report the injury without risking his job and losing out on workers' compensation. He got too close to a baling machine, causing a severe injury that resulted in the loss of his eye. The man left screaming, drove off, and returned a week later, simply stating he had an emergency and now had only one eye. I once had to drop something off for my mother-in-law's boyfriend during his lunch break. Everyone sits in their cars for lunch, and I noticed nearly everyone was drinking from brown paper bags unless their windows were too darkly tinted to see inside. Story 12. Medical doctors. They even have their own dedicated recovery sections at some centers, which perhaps help maintain the idea that they're all-knowing. During my time there, I heard openly admitted and even laughed about behaviors that I found deeply disturbing and never thought possible. Imagine an anesthesiologist sharing with other doctors how he would take substances for himself while the patient was on the operating table. He knew the patient was experiencing pain, but also knew they wouldn't remember it due to other medications he was giving. This wasn't shared with regret, but more in a "can you top this" kind of way. During one session, when asked who believed in God, only 1 out of 30 doctors raised their hand. Then someone, a user speaking, flippantly asked who thinks they are God. At least 10 hands went up. I've never looked at a doctor the same way since. Story 13. The tech industry was heavily involved with substances a few years ago. I believe it has diminished somewhat, but I saw enough firsthand to anecdotally confirm the reports on it. They were promoted as tools for optimizing big brain ideas and disruptive thinking. So a lot of both management and average workers explored them for a while. They also served as a way to make otherwise mundane daily work more interesting. This was mostly in smaller daily doses, but I strongly suspect most people who only microdose were taking more than they let on. This trend was also fueled a bit by working from home. People who might not have otherwise taken the risk at the office but were still curious went ahead and got into it at home. To be honest, I think this trend at least partially explains some of why the tech industry seems to have gone a bit, well, strange in recent years. It seems less focused on solving actual problems and more on chasing ideas and novelties. Story 14. Scientists thought this might not be a surprise, often find that grass can lower mental inhibitions. This allows for connections to be made that are ordinarily blocked. It's similar to how pain blockers chemically reduce pain or how antivirals inhibit growth by blocking connections. Grass, in this context, can inhibit whatever is typically suppressing certain thoughts. This can lead to increased creativity and intense focus. Musicians, for example, are well known to use grass. Playing music often involves overcoming various inhibitions. Take guitar playing. You need to trust your strumming hand will be consistent so you can focus. You might encounter passages where you need to coordinate both hands simultaneously or shift chords in ways that don't feel entirely natural. There's often an underlying anxiety about making mistakes. If you can reduce this anxiety and trust your hands or your mouth for wind instruments, you can often play better. When sight reading, knowing your hands will execute what you're reading allows the process to flow more smoothly. Story 15. Every single person at your local grocery store is using substances. Not just Walmart or other big chains you expect, but every single one. My co-workers had code terms for getting spiked in the break room, and our manager usually joined in. Even the meat department butchers were often visibly under the influence. After working at my first grocery store, everyone I've been at since, if I observe carefully, is the same. How else does someone ask 100 people how they are per hour while bagging and scanning groceries? Even the elderly folks at my stores have tried vaping. I've seen a man become ill in the bathroom, and customer service is always the most affected. They probably have to be. Grocery customers can be really challenging. So yes, many cashiers are using substances, but they deserve to be. They've earned it. You'd be surprised how many perfectly kind folks are difficult customers simply because they've never had a job like cashiering. Story 16. I was working as a laborer on a construction site when the site manager announced a surprise inspection for the following day. The next morning, the inspector arrived and observed 3 names on the sign-in sheet, yet there were 50 to 75 people working on the site. Consequently, everyone was tested and only the 3 individuals who had signed in passed. The site was shut down and we had a new manager by the following week. Bonus incident, on the same site, one of the ground workers was asked to leave due to the clear intoxication. He parked an excavator next to the gate, unintentionally blocking people in, and then left with the keys. I later learned that most heavy machinery can be started with something as simple as a spoon. Story 17. I've observed concerning situations in urgent care centers and hospitals. On one occasion, I found a doctor slumped against a bathroom door. I also witnessed a nursing practitioner discreetly writing a prescription for unknown substances for a doctor. They seemed nervous when questioned about it. My experience in senior living facilities has also been eye-opening. The night staff often appear to be under the influence. Just this morning, I found a toilet in an unoccupied room that had clearly been used for retching during the night. No one reported feeling ill, leading me to suspect someone was intoxicated at work. This is particularly notable because we recently dismissed a caregiver for smoking grass on the property, yet I've personally seen the nursing and executive directors using vapes at work multiple times. I'm not here to judge, but I sincerely hope that those caring for me in my old age are not under the influence. Story 18. Nursing was quite challenging 10-15 years ago, marked by a significant amount of vicarious trauma and stress among nurses, coupled with easier access to certain medications. When I was nursing in New Zealand during that period, only the most potent substances were securely locked away. However, various other medications would regularly leave the hospital in nurses' pockets. I have numerous stories of individuals being found in distressing situations within hospital facilities. I haven't worked as a nurse in a long time, but I can confirm that security measures have significantly improved over time. The implementation of digital management systems and enhanced computer tracking has made it much easier to identify and prevent these incidents. It was certainly a challenging time to be in the profession. Story 19. It might seem strange to say given their strict testing policies, but some mills are heavily impacted by hard substance use. I've also worked at a few car dealerships, and in my experience, multiple DUIs due to drinking were common among employees. Dealerships, however, seem to be very lenient. The last one I was at did a test, but they informed me they only cared if it was the serious ones. Lastly, there's the Blue Beacon, another place with quite rigorous testing. I worked at my location for almost a year, even making it up to tractor man for those unfamiliar with the role. I was actually barred from becoming a supervisor due to past altercations with other employees. By far, Blue Beacon was my most challenging and unsettling job, and it was deeply affected by substance use. Basically, anything you could imagine. Most of us were using various forms of grass, and at the time, I was also heavily using substances. Everyone shared. It was a chaotic environment, and despite the random tests, no one seemed to care. I believe this was because you'd have to be significantly impaired or desperate to want to work at my location during that period. Story 20. It seems that law firms and especially line cooks in the food industry often experience significant substance use. As a former line cook myself, and a clean one, I've witnessed this firsthand. From truck stops to retirement homes and hospitals, I've consistently seen at least one coworker get caught. These individuals are under immense pressure and are often using a combination of substances. If it's the latter, you'd be wise to avoid that restaurant. They are definitely on something. Imagine them standing over fires, trying to recall intricate menu details and ingredients, all while rushing between the grill, the flat top, the oven, and the fridge. It's a high-stakes environment. I quickly learned not just how to prepare food, but also how to stay out of their way. Story 21. When I worked as a personal trainer, I made some unexpected observations. At my first gym, it was quite apparent that many of the male trainers, including the gym manager, were using enhancers. Beyond that, a significant number of the personal trainers regularly used substances on the weekends. I even had one colleague who would go home in the afternoon to use grass and then return to train clients in the evening. I was once invited to a poker night with about 5 or 6 of them, and they were all quite spiked. Consequently, I ended up winning the tournament. I was genuinely shocked, as I had always assumed everyone in the health and fitness industry would be entirely focused on clean living. Story 22. I've observed a noticeable trend among technicians in certain trades. Many seem to be under the influence of various substances, including alcohol and grass, and a number have had legal troubles. Then there are a few exceptions who are completely straight-laced, with their only vices being caffeine or tobacco. I believe this stems from the demanding nature of the work, often performed in challenging conditions, for pay that is decent but not exceptional. There's also a significant amount of stress in these often thankless situations, where technicians are frequently perceived as the bearer of bad news or are expected to perform miracles that aren't possible. I've had more than a few coworkers openly discuss their preferred substances, and others who are clearly using grass a good portion of the time or carrying alcohol in coolers in their trucks. Story 23. I once lived in an area where RV manufacturing was the dominant industry. Nearly every company offered a straight piece rate or significant incentives for hitting production targets. This environment led to a widespread presence of other stimulants. Those who didn't use illicit substances were often incredibly reliant on caffeine and energy drinks. This was, and still largely is, an open secret within the industry. In recent years, as substances have become more prevalent nationally, they've also taken root in this industry for the same reasons they are popular elsewhere, but also for self-medication. If you get injured and are unable to work, even with company pay or short-term disability, your income often drops significantly. This creates a strong temptation to use pills from a coworker to keep working, a temptation many people unfortunately succumb to. Story 24. I've encountered substance use in a few different work environments. During my month working in a cold storage warehouse, multiple people in training openly discussed how common substance use was among the workers. I was even warned not to touch any white powder on boxes, as it was likely illicit substances. The ironic part was that you weren't allowed to ask for basic pain relievers like ibuprofen or Tylenol for a headache, as it would make you seem incompetent. Another area where I've observed this in is in security. Many individuals in this field would use grass, whether on overnight or day shifts. On my very first day, my supervisor was openly using a vape pen, and that's when I realized the relaxed atmosphere of the place. And then there's construction. It seems to be a common thread across all types of construction sites. You'll find someone operating heavy equipment while under the influence of something. These individuals might have been doing so for anywhere from 5 to 40 years. I even met a former Job Corps instructor who had become a department head. This individual would use substances daily. Everyone knew about it, but he wasn't going to be fired. He was too integral to the department's operations. He was responsible for about 5 to 6 trades and constantly tried to ensure they had the newest equipment, all while talking at an incredibly fast pace. Story 25. During my 3 years working in a 120-bed inpatient rehab facility, I observed that nurses, police officers, postal employees, and lawyers were among the most common professions seeking treatment in that order. However, if we were to exclude alcohol, police officers might drop lower on the list. It's clear that high-stress jobs often contribute to these challenges. It's also important to note that strong unions played a crucial role in these individuals attending rehab without losing their jobs. The risk of job jeopardy was often the primary motivation for them to seek treatment. Interestingly, nurses and police officers had the highest recovery rates. These patients were generally the least problematic. They were adept at following instructions and adhering to treatment plans. I believe they understood the direct correlation between specific actions and desired outcomes. Lawyers, on the other hand, often earned significant incomes, and this financial abundance sometimes presented its own set of challenges. And if you're enjoying this video so far and you're learning a thing or two from these stories, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 26. From a recovery perspective, based on my many years of involvement in an anonymous association, it appears that individuals from certain professions are more likely to seek and benefit from group support and fellowship for issues, including both substances and alcohol. Professions that frequently seek group support include nurses and other frontline caregivers. This encompasses direct support workers, social workers, and mental health advocates. Writers and media personnel, journalists, radio workers, and editors are often represented. Cooks and hospitality workers, the entire spectrum from waiters and chefs to hosts, bartenders, and dishwashers is often present. Mechanics and skilled trades. This covers those working with cars, trucks, railroads, motorcycles, as well as electricians, construction workers, and plumbers. Teachers, particularly those involved in arts like music, theater, visual arts, or literature. On the other hand, professions that less frequently seek or rarely engage with group support, often due to a reasonable distrust of confidentiality not being honored, include law enforcement. This spans all levels, from police officers to correction workers, attorneys, and judges, doctors, across all specialties. Story 27. Decades ago, I worked for a state bar association. It was truly astonishing to witness the number of lawyers who struggled with alcoholism, substance use, or simply abandoned their clients, relocating to places like Thailand, Vietnam, or Costa Rica. They would leave behind hundreds or even thousands of files, with many cases, including those involving serious crimes, left incomplete. A significant part of my colleagues' jobs was to pursue these errant lawyers and initiate disbarment proceedings. What I found most disturbing was that not one of them expressed any remorse or guilt, as if they were breaking a lawyer code. Their actions were simply beyond unethical. This experience was unlike anything I had ever seen and ultimately dissuaded me from pursuing law school myself. Story 28. Warehouse workers often use more performance-enhancing substances than athletes. The physical demands of many warehouse jobs can be incredibly intense, almost superhuman. I used to work in inventory control at a furniture company called Living Spaces. The pickers, the individuals responsible for retrieving sofas from enormous racks and then loading them onto delivery trucks, were frequently using stimulants. Some even injected human growth hormones. Those who didn't use these substances typically didn't last more than a month in the role. These same individuals often went out on deliveries too. Several were dismissed for aggressive outbursts in front of customers. I recall one instance where a worker, in a fit of rage, forcefully threw a love seat from the back of a truck. Story 29. In my experience, restaurant work takes the lead when it comes to prevalent substance use. Working in a tourist town, I genuinely believed I had a drinking problem until I witnessed the sheer extent of the shenanigans in this industry. The person preparing your food likely using substances or intoxicated. Your server almost certainly a few drinks in or on substances. The bartender also very likely intoxicated or using substances. Of course, this can vary depending on the type of the restaurant. I worked in that industry for about 6 years and I made sure to always be sober aside from taste testing new beers on tap. Hangovers don't count, lol. I used to regularly check the local newspaper to see which server had been caught for public intoxication, possession charges, or a DUI each week because arrests were actually a constant occurrence here. Story 30. For me, the presence of substance use in certain industries is quite notable. In metal fabrication and manufacturing where I work, it's common to find that a significant number of employees use substances or alcohol to manage the demands of the job. This is precisely why my company doesn't conduct tests. If they did, they'd likely lose almost their entire workforce. Similarly, the restaurant industry also seems to have a high prevalence of substance use. My wife, who worked as a cook when she was younger, shared similar observations. She noted that nearly every cook she knew used some form of substance to cope with fast-paced environment. During breaks, they would often go to their cars to smoke or take whatever their preferred substance was. She never confronted them about it, understanding that doing so would mean losing most of her staff. Story 31. As an adult, I've been quite surprised to learn about the prevalence of fixation and behavioral issues among school teachers. As a child, you simply don't notice or understand these things, but looking back with adult eyes, the signs became clear. You start connecting the dots. The gym teacher with a consistently flushed face, the educator perpetually sipping coffee and appearing sick, or the science teacher who exhibited incredibly erratic behavior in class. Then there are the rumors, stories of teachers engaging in inappropriate relationships or married teachers having affairs. Sometimes the teacher would quietly disappear and the whispers would suggest an impropriety. I had a good friend in her early 20s, fresh out of college, who was a kindergarten teacher. She was the epitome of a perfect kindergarten teacher in her demeanor and speech, yet she openly admitted to engaging in incredibly risky behavior. It's astonishing that she never compromised her job. She truly had blind luck avoiding being caught given the stories she shared. Later, in my 40s, after moving from New York City to the suburbs, I observed that many women in the area were teachers, largely due to the limited economic opportunities. These were often women navigating their first divorces, just discovering how easily they could find encounters through dating apps. The stories I heard included texting during classes while children were present and engaging in overtly behavior. There were also male teachers with bad reputations. The level of perceived debauchery was quite high. Honestly, I no longer view elementary and high school teachers in the same light. Now, I often assume they might be intoxicated using grass or engaging in inappropriate behaviors. I want to be clear that I'm not judging as long as no children are being harmed, but it seems many teachers are under immense stress and dealing with it in unhealthy ways. Story 32. My experience suggests that legal professionals, particularly legal secretaries and paralegals, though many lawyers also struggle, face immense and constant pressure. They deal with multiple overlapping deadlines, often working for demanding individuals, and with clients who can be uncooperative, dangerous, or deluded, sometimes all at once. My insights come from over 20 years in the field, having worked in various settings from corporate counsel to personal injury firms and mass tort settlement funds. It was an informative but often challenging experience. A common unspoken motto seemed to be spiked all the time, hope you all are too. Story 33. Perhaps not surprisingly, the beer industry often operates with a particular mindset. If employees can be trusted to be responsible around unlimited free alcohol during work hours, management tends not to scrutinize what they consume outside of work. I've had managers openly share stories about substance use from the previous weekend as if it were just casual conversation. When my brewery grew large enough to hire an HR representative on her first day, she inquired about the testing policy. The owner simply laughed and replied that if they were to implement tests, only 2 employees would remain and he wouldn't be one of them. Story 34. Trust me on this one, anything corporate. I completed a very high-level corporate internship for a year, living with other interns my age. My role was in corporate sales, and my best friend worked in HR talent acquisition. At some point, middle management decided our company needed to start testing. Team leaders from across the business essentially pushed back, stating they didn't want this because they knew people on their teams used substances, either recreationally or for a performance boost at work. Their logic was that these were all high achievers, there was no noticeable negative impact, so what was the problem? Despite the resistance, the company proceeded with implementation and a significant number of people were dismissed. Fast forward to the end of our internship program, and the business had noticeably declined in terms of productivity and talent. I never quite understood their decision-making process there, especially for what is a very well-known company. Story 35. I once observed the head professor and doctor of a clinic in Hamburg, Germany, who would sometimes rub the tip of his nose almost incessantly during conversations. I never confirmed whether it was related to substance use, but it seemed highly probable it was one of the two. I also know several female psychologists who smoke, though never in the presence of their clients. They seem to carry a significant amount of self-contempt for their fixation, mentally criticizing themselves because this unhealthy, compulsive behavior is entirely contrary to the life advice they offer to their patients. It's not that a female psychiatrist shouldn't enjoy smoking in her free time, it's more about how they personally feel about it. It appears some of these therapists also struggle with a form of perfectionism, and this type of substance-related fixation doesn't align with their self-image at all, and yet such individuals work in counseling. It's a rather poignant situation. Story 36. Healthcare and EMS certainly stand out in my experience. I worked in the ER for about 7 years in my 20s after spending 2 years on an ambulance. After shifts, we'd often gather, and doctors would sometimes bring substances which everyone would use. It was quite an intense environment. What was particularly striking was when I was considered for a promotion after about 5 years. Because it was a different position, I had to go through the entire testing process again. Somehow, I tested positive for grass. I hadn't used it since college, so I was genuinely shocked and confused. The only explanation I could think of was a recent gathering with other doctors and nurses where many of them were using it. I remember no one believing my explanation, and the doctors would tease me for months afterward for not using synthetic quiz for the test, as many of them apparently did. Story 37. I'm not sure if by illegal you mean substances or also those illegal obtained, such as prescription medications bought on the street. If we include the latter, I would confidently say teachers. When I worked in public education, nearly every teacher I knew was using some form of medication and not always something prescribed by their doctor. The extreme stress placed on them by both administration and parents is immense, leading some to turn to stimulants and anxiety medications as a coping mechanism. This was happening even at a standard elementary school in a small town of about 20,000 people. I wouldn't be surprised to see these numbers increase in more urban areas with higher student-to-teacher ratios, in areas with less funding, and certainly in regions like certain red states where education is not prioritized. I don't judge those teachers at all. In fact, I feel immense empathy for them. Many are wonderful individuals who felt a genuine calling to teach, only to be pushed to their limits and treated poorly. It's an unacceptable situation, but unfortunately, I don't foresee it changing anytime soon. Story 38. I believe that people use illicit substances far more than anyone might imagine or care to admit. As an adult, now leading a more stable life, I can reflect on my teenage years and my late 20s when I was deeply involved in substances and the surrounding lifestyle. Initially, as a teenager, I was genuinely shocked by how many highly functional individuals I encountered in the world, people you would never suspect of having a fixation. Through my experiences, I came to understand that anyone can become subject to fixation. While I have hundreds of examples, one particular story stands out. For anonymity, I won't disclose specific locations, names, or the exact time frame, because there was a wealthy and publicly respected family living in a high-class suburban home within a typical gated community, complete with a golf course and large, expensive houses on acre lots. Their last name was widely recognized in the surrounding area. The parents were middle-aged and had 3 children, a teenager, a toddler, and a young adult. The mother was a college professor and the father owned a small factory where his young child served as his right-hand person. I refer to this in the past tense, but it's possible this situation is still ongoing. The teenage daughter was a high school student and arguably the most well-known and beloved person in town due to her charisma, social status, and promising future. The father initially had a casual affinity for substances, a let's get a gram and drive around the city kind of occasional indulgence, common among some factory workers. However, he started experimenting with other stuff that some of his supervisors were using, and it quickly became a severe fixation for him. Shockingly, his wife, son, and even his daughter eventually became involved and developed brutal users themselves. This continued for a significant period. By the time I lost contact with his family, they were all managing surprisingly well despite being a household of users. You truly would never have known that the mother was using substances throughout her day. Story 39. Daycare teachers. I've worked at a few daycares in different locations and have many friends still working at daycares. A significant number of staff, from those in the infant room to directors, are often using grass. Yes, even in self-proclaimed Christian daycares. I once worked as a temp for 2 months at one of the top Christian daycares in the DFW area, doing a favor for a friend. This was the type of place where everything was centered around God and Jesus, with only gospel books and songs. Yet many of the staff were using substances. If not, then they were taking pills, not necessarily illegal substances, but, still concerning. Story 40. I've observed a significant amount of substance use across various professions, and in one particular family I know, it seems to be a pervasive issue. My ex-boyfriend's sister, now a flight attendant, formerly a waitress in Phoenix and Scottsdale, Arizona, obtained stuff from a friend. She then supplies it to her mother, who works in the finance industry, and potentially to her cousin. This cousin, who works as a building repainter and used to be a gym trainer, has a Ritalin prescription but has also obtained it from the flight attendant. He also uses grass daily. Tragically, the ex-boyfriend's brother passed away involving substances. Before his passing, he had recently been released from house arrest and jail, and was unemployed, though he had previously worked in a warehouse. The ex-boyfriend's aunt, who is also the cousin's mother and works as a hairdresser, uses her son's stuff and also uses grass. She has also obtained stuff from the flight attendant. It seems they all illegally obtain stuff from the flight attendant and the other ones from the cousin who works as a building repainter. The flight attendant herself frequently uses substances and always carries small baggies. My ex-boyfriend and his cousin also have significant substance use issues. It's a wide spectrum of industries affected, and in this family, it seems to be a deeply ingrained pattern. I have genuinely never witnessed such widespread sharing of medications, prescribed or otherwise, as casually as if they were candy. It's truly disheartening and unsettling to see families operate this way in the US. Story 41. During several summers working as a construction laborer, I consistently observed individuals on every site who would use substances and drink alcohol during their 9 a.m. break. While it wasn't everyone, it was more than a few. What always made me nervous was that many of these individuals were operating heavy machinery. In lifeguarding, I don't recall seeing much substance use. The pay is typically low, making it difficult to afford regular substance or alcohol use. I've often heard that restaurant workers, particularly waiters and cooks, use a significant amount of stuff. However, in my own experience working in many restaurants, I've never witnessed it firsthand. Again, I question how they could afford it when earning only slightly above minimum wage. Perhaps it's more prevalent in upscale establishments. Drinking the establishment's beer, however, was a constant habit among the closing staff. The boss would often get frustrated, but firing everyone wasn't a practical solution. Story 42. Doctors. I'm surprised more people aren't talking about this. Like, really, doctors are crazy. I guess all medical care staff are kind of this way. The wildest party I've ever been to was at a cabin with a bunch of doctors. I'm not a wild substance person at all, so this all felt like an episode of Euphoria to me. The substances were laid out on the kitchen island like some kind of candy buffet. Seeing a pediatrician taking what seemed like a lot stuff because her macro dose of other stuff just weren't hitting was a real trip. I once went to a party and some EMTs showed up. Before they left, they hooked themselves up to IVs to get fluids before working a shift. Story 43. Literally any profession. I go to music festivals and raves, places where most people are on at least one sort of illegal substance, usually more. I meet so many doctors, nurses, lawyers, high up tax accountants, engineers, etc., and so many of them end up being users or the type to microdose substances on a workday. But nothing makes me more afraid to have kids and put them through the public education system than the party-hardy teachers I've met at some of these things. Some chick who is stuck in a K-hole on Saturday night drooling on herself should not be going in on Monday morning to work with kindergartners, period. Story 44. Everybody be talking about the substance and normalized use of them, and the thing I'm most curious about is the question that never gets asked here. Why is it okay to rely on substances like this? For someone who doesn't do them and knows it will be bad if he starts, I'm at a huge disadvantage in the first place not to be able to operate like a machine on a little stuff. Is the only solution to do a substance so you can get through the day? I have trouble in general with working, but I don't know how much of it is the pre-existing mental disability or the fact that I'm not doing stuff like my coworker is. Story 45. I think everyone knows that stockbrokers and traders are constantly spiked up, but the level of it still astounds me. It's pretty much expected and even encouraged by the higher ups that they should be on stuff, otherwise they will be underperforming. There are stories of interns being sent to go pick up the goods from the dealer. Hell, the craziest story I've heard is where a big bank gave a job to their dealer so that they were getting the substances in-house, basically paying for them through the salary of the made-up job rather than having a cash exchange. Story 46. I've made some observations regarding potential substance use in certain professions. In politics, one can sometimes gauge this by observing the size of individuals' pupils. If someone with blue eyes has pupils that randomly appear black, especially under bright lights, that should cause constriction. It can be an indicator. Conversely, if their pupils are tiny pinpricks in dimmer lighting, that should cause dilation, and that's another sign. Medical students also present a concerning situation. The way substances, for example, function mean that if you study while under its influence, you might need it in your system again to thoroughly recall that information later. This suggests a potential lifelong dependence for effective recall, which is deeply concerning as it could endanger future patients. Yet, among medical students, it was almost a running joke that using such stimulants was necessary to pass medical school. Story 47. Truck drivers often face unique challenges, particularly those who struggle with staying awake during night shifts. Some individuals, for various reasons, find it difficult to maintain alertness behind the wheel after dark. In an effort to stay awake when they feel it's necessary, they might resort to extreme measures, and it's not uncommon to encounter instances of substance use. I recall working with a driver a long time ago who had a consistent night route. Although it seemed like a straightforward job, he frequently struggled with staying awake. This issue escalated when he fell asleep at the wheel driving through a concrete barricade. This resulted in the total loss of the truck he was operating, valued at approximately $160,000, along with significant damage to the cargo. When confronted by our boss, he attributed the incident to running out of substances. Surprisingly, he apparently retained his job because the boss also used substances and understood the situation. However, he was still given 3 weeks off without pay for the considerable damage caused. Story 48. I would say pharmacy, having been a pharmacy tech across almost every chain for the past 10 years, people did attempt to steal and got away with it for a while, like 3 months, but they spiked down so hard on that it was unbelievable. There's a reason why almost every chain, regardless of the state, requires clear cups in the pharmacy. Apparently, someone was getting disposable coffee drinks at Starbucks, sneaking some bottles, among other things, into the cup, tossing it into the trash, and then collecting it from the trash after it was thrown out at the end of his or her shift. Also, I knew someone who was stealing birth control. She had our insurance, so it was free. So like, what? Throw away a career for some substances? Story 49. When I was a young chef, drinking on duty was positively encouraged. Most of the chefs I knew were alcoholic, and many would happily tell you how they cooked better when intoxicated. The hours were also incredibly long, often 12 to 15-hour days, and back then, it was 6-day weeks as well. On a shift that long, it was easy to sink 8 to 10 pints and a couple of crafty vodkas. Around 4 p.m., chefs would start to wander off to the toilet. That would get you through the evening. Then after work, it would often be a couple more drinks or heading to a nightclub for a lot of drinks before going home and having a couple in the hope that the grass and the amount of alcohol consumed would counteract the other stuff. Hopefully, you'd get 4 or 5 hours of sleep before doing it all again the next day. Story 50. I've been working in a factory for the last 11 years, and it's a pretty big company with a lot of people. Honestly, the majority of folks here are at minimum users or alcoholics. There are very few sober individuals. Even a lot of the managers do substances. I'll admit, I'm definitely a user myself and I don't regret it, but I also feel different from the rest of those people. If you have any ambitions, dreams, or even a brain capable of thinking beyond high school, please don't work in a factory. It's such a miserable existence. It really is a culmination of the worst types of people, and I don't mean that because I hate people. I mean it because it's just for people who have nothing better to do in life. The pay might be great, but being around people who still treat things like it's high school is so incredibly frustrating. And if any of these stories got to you, well, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're gonna love this. I'll catch you in that video.